It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon our keynote presentation. Many of you may know Sir Ken. He is known for the many books that he's written. He's a New York Times bestseller. Books that he's written include Out of Our Minds. Many of you may be familiar with The Element. There's also the follow-up sequel to that, Finding Your Element. And then most recently, the book came out, I believe, a year ago on creative schools. But many of you probably know him for his TED Talk. And the most famous TED Talk, actually the most watched TED Talk of all time, is Sir Ken's TED Talk on Do Schools Kill Creativity? Right? How many of you have seen that? Excellent. Well, count yourself among the 350 million people in 160 countries that have watched that video. So you may know him for all that. I know him because of experience that I had 15 years ago. I went to a conference in Los Angeles and I met this gentleman who was presenting the keynote there. And I thought I would have a 5-minute conversation with him. An hour and a half later, I had found a new friend. I found a new mentor. I found a new collaborator for who the past 15 years is someone that I've gone to for advice and counsel, but also someone that I've gone to for personal inspiration for the work that we do here every day. So the success that we've had in New Jersey is due in no small part to the inspiration provided by our keynote speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce to you my friend, Sir Ken Robinson. How are you, Ken?
So thank you very much. And can I thank you first, and Bob in particular, but all of you, for being so accommodating to changing the time around of my comments. I love Bob. There he is, right in front of you. You can see how lovable he is. And when he asked me about this, I don't know, 3 months ago, I said, absolutely, what could possibly go wrong? And I said, but I will be coming back from Europe the night before. He said, no problem. And then he confirmed, it was my fault, I didn't check it. I realized that having planned to be back from Europe to get home after a 3-week trip last night, I would have got home at midnight. And to do the talk at 9:15 in the morning in New Jersey, I would have to have been up at 4 o'clock to get here to do it at what would have been 6:15 for me. So, you know that thing about love being unconditional? Turns out it's not. So, I'm very grateful that we managed to push this back. And also, I want to say just a couple of words of thanks generally to, firstly, to the New Jersey Arts Education Partnership, which I genuinely think does fantastic work on behalf not just of arts education, but of education. And I think it's very important to recognize that when Bob said earlier that being an advocate isn't something you do, it's something that you are, I think the analogy applies directly to arts education. We use a separate phrase for it, but this isn't about education plus the arts. The conviction behind this entire enterprise is that the arts help to provide the qualities and dynamics and experiences which we want education as a whole to provide. They're part of the essential mix of education if we're to get it right for our children. So the New Jersey Arts Education Partnership has done great work for a long time in deepening our understanding of what's going on in the arts in the state, but also in promoting their importance and why the provision should be even better than it is. I want to thank the state as a whole for listening hard to the arguments. And I also want to pay a particular tribute to Bob, not just because he was sensible and sensitive about the timing of my talk, but because he has been a long-term campaigner and advocate of the arts, but more than that, he has, probably more than anybody else, understood the need to collect usable information on what's really going on the understanding that you can't really tackle a problem until you diagnose it. You can't promote something until you understand how the situation lies just at present. So he and the work he's done over a very long time have been very helpful and informative to people, not just in New Jersey, but nationally and internationally. So I want to thank him for that. You know, there's a reason I've been a friend with Bob for a long time. It's not because I'm short of friends, as you can see, but because I'm particularly drawn and attracted to the work that Bob has been doing for a long time. I've been doing a lot of work in the arts for a long time too. And I wanted just to address a few issues that arise from the surveys that have been published in New Jersey, but which are longer term issues too. What the reports that have been published in advance of this conference show is that there's been a great improvement in access to the arts in schools in New Jersey. It rightly now focuses on the issues of access, not just of access, but of quality and equity. And that's important. It's like with any other field, really. It's one thing to get nutrients to people. It's another to look at the quality of the nutrients and how much they benefit them. But it also shows something that we really need to think about, which is that there is a persistent hierarchy in education. The arts are still some way down the food chain in education, not just in New Jersey, though they're still, but everywhere. There is a well-established hierarchy, which I've been arguing against for a long time now, in education, which goes something like this, that you have the mathematics, sciences, languages at the top. Some way down come the humanities, then come the arts, and with luck, there may be some physical education in the school. And in the arts, there's another hierarchy, which the surveys indicate is still the case. Art and music are normally given a higher status and more provision in elementary and in high schools than theatre and dance. In that TED talk that Bob mentioned, which was 11 years ago now, I made a comment about dance being as important as mathematics in schools. And last year, I was taken to task on that by an interviewer from the BBC. She was fantastic, actually. She's a great interviewer. And they took me back to one of my old schools in Liverpool to have a look around, which incidentally had closed. I was thinking about this recently. I was involved in helping to establish the Liverpool Institute for the Performing Arts in Liverpool some years ago. It's the school where Paul McCartney is patron. It's his old school. I went to school across the city centre. So his school is now one of the leading arts academies in Europe. My old school burnt down. What this means, we don't know. But it has an effect on my resume. So I went back to my old school, and the interviewer said to me, in that TED talk, you say that math and dance are just as important, or that dance is as important as mathematics. And I said, that's right. And she said, you can't be serious. And I said, but I am absolutely serious about it. I think it's a very important test case. And I want to say a few words about it in just a moment. But I ended up giving a lecture in London last year at the London School of Contemporary Dance, entitled that, Why Dance is as Important as Mathematics. And it's a test case for me, because I think if we don't understand why that's true, it's hard to understand where the arts really figure in the ecosystem of education. There are two reasons, as I see it, for the hierarchy in schools. And one of them is to do with utility. The reason the arts are a little way down the hierarchy is because there's an assumption they're not as relevant to the main purposes of education, particularly the economic purposes of education, as, for example, the sciences or the STEM disciplines. There has been in America, as you know, and in other parts of the world too, for a long time now, an increasing emphasis on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. They are very important. There's nothing I've ever had to say on the subject of the curriculum that suggests otherwise. Science and engineering and technology and math are critical in our education systems. But so are the arts and so are the humanities. And there is a movement, as you know, to get the arts included in there, and sometimes now the acronym is called STEAM. All right, but what about the humanities, like STEAM? Now, where does this end? We're juggling these awkward acronyms when really what we ought to be looking at is not a way of coming up with a clever acronym, but agreeing what education is for and what sort of education and curriculum we need to provide to meet those purposes. Well, one of them, I say, is an assumption that the arts are not important for economic growth or development, or that if you do an arts subject at school, it's unlikely to benefit you in a subsequent career. One of the conversations I had with the BBC interviewer was around that. She said, well, dance, mathematics is so much more important than dance. I said, why is that? And she said, well, it's much more useful for subsequent employment. I said, well, how many people do you know who did maths at school went on to be mathematicians or to do statistics or economics? She said, well, of course, not many. Only a few go on to work in mathematics. But she said, but maths encourages all kinds of general developments which are important to people no matter what they do. I said, well, exactly the same thing is true for dance. Very few people go on from school to become dancers, but that's not really the criteria that we should be applying. What dance teaches are all sorts of things which are critical to the well-being and holistic development of individuals in ways that I'll come back to in just a minute, which also benefit them in all kinds of ways, including economic, personal, and cultural. But there is nonetheless this resilient idea that some disciplines are automatically more important for work. And I want to challenge that. The second is that there is an assumption that about the status of knowledge in schools, that somehow what mathematics and the sciences, for example, teach is more objective, rigorous, and intellectually demanding than the sorts of things the arts are concerned with. I think we've got to challenge this too. The reason is that we've come to conflate knowledge and understanding in schools for historical reasons with a particular form of academic work. And the truth is that what the arts have to teach is just as rigorous, just as objective, just as disciplined, just as hard as what we learn in other areas of the curriculum. I spoke at the London School of Contemporary Dance. I'm a patron there. And if you look at dancers at work, honing their craft, practicing their discipline, understanding the aesthetics, the cultural significance, and the mathematics, by the way, of the work they do, it's every bit as demanding as work you'll find in any science laboratory in its own way. I'm not trying to conflate them. But the assumption somehow is that sciences are to do with knowledge and reason, and the arts are to do just with feeling and with creativity. So I think they're among the reasons why the hierarchy persists. And what it comes to is a sense that somehow the arts are not as important academically or economically as other disciplines, and therefore, if we can make provision for them, well, that's all well and good, but it's not really essential in the way that we have to provide for mathematics and the sciences. For example, very few people are publishing data these days to show that maths is being taught in all schools or where the gaps are. There are very few reports out there trying to persuade people that mathematics and physics are important. But in every conversation about the arts, you always have to start off by saying why they matter. And I hope we're going to reach the point before too long where we don't have to keep saying why they matter. We talk about what we can do to make the provision for them even better than it is now. So why do they matter? I've been involved in the arts for a long time, and the TED talk I gave several, but that particular one wasn't about the arts. I have to say, I did include a story at the end of it about the dancer Gillian Lynn. But I was more concerned in that talk with education in general and creativity in general. But as Bob said, I published a book last year called Creative Schools, Revolutionizing Education from the Ground Up. And I did it for several reasons. One was because so many people had seen the TED Talks I gave. People like them, but they often go on to say, but you tell us what the problem is, you don't tell us what the answer is. And I have several responses to that. I mean, one of them is, it was 18 minutes. Give me a break. There's a limit to what you can cover, no matter how quickly you talk about things. The other is that I've been at this a long time, like you have, I'm sure, many of you. I was at an event a while ago in, I think it was in Ohio, I don't recall exactly now, but I was speaking to the students in a sports stadium. And before I went to give this talk, I had lunch with some of the faculty, and one of them said to me, "You've been at this a long time now, haven't you?" I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Trying to change education." I said, "I have, yeah." He said, "How long is it?" 7 years now. I said, 7 years? How do you mean? He said, "You know, since that TED talk." And I said, "Yes, but I was alive before that. You know, this was just a moment. You know, I showed up and gave this talk, but it was in the middle of a rather long odyssey to campaign on behalf of these ideas, and not just to argue for them, but to see them implemented." And what I was saying in Creator Schools is that this isn't a theory. The book is an answer to the question, you know, what do we do now? And it's full of examples about why the old system doesn't work, why it's desperately important that we transform it, and what the transformation really looks like. And the arts are part of that. They're not all of it, by the way, but they're part of it. But I do urge you to think about this. That the premise is that we are living in times of genuine revolution. And I don't mean this in some metaphorical or figurative sense. There are challenges now that you face and your children face, that our cities face, our communities face, for which there is absolutely no precedent in the whole course of human history. We can look back at times that were tumultuous. I mean, most of human culture has been fairly tumultuous. We know that. There have been revolutions. You know, there was the French Revolution, there was the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution. We had a small revolution in England at one point. It was a rather polite affair. People went around apologizing afterwards. And then there was the American Revolution, frankly, which we still haven't forgiven you for. But, you know, you had your reasons. But, you know, we've had the Industrial Revolution. We've had 4 of them so far, as it turns out. But there are forces at work now for which even all of these tumultuous changes have not prepared us. One of them is the extraordinary rate of technological growth and development. You know, it's when I gave that talk 10 years ago, I'm not harping on about the talk, it's just you mentioned it, but 10 years ago, I remember saying that we have no idea what the world will look like in 10 years' time. Well, here we are. And we had no idea what the world was going to look like in 10 years' time, did we? 10 years ago, when I gave that talk, in 2006, nobody had an iPhone. Nobody had a smartphone. We had Blackberries, which we thought were smart, but we turned out to be wrong about that. But we didn't have iPhones. We didn't have the vast proliferation of mobile technologies that we see now. We didn't have the internet metastasizing around the planet in the way that it is now. We didn't have most of what people currently take for granted as the ordinary way of human life then. This only 10 years ago. 10 years from now, there's no question, technologically, that your grandchildren will be looking at pictures of you with your iPhone, your iPad, with patronizing smiles. You know, they will. They'll be saying, "Look at you with your iPad." I mean, bless. You know, like, what was that? It was like a thing that you carried around. I guarantee you, these devices will appear to us, to the next generation, like those large phones that Austin Powers used to walk around with. And the reason is that artificial intelligence is bringing about the next major revolution, and nobody knows what it will mean. I spent the last 2 days at the Microsoft conference in Florida called Envision, and people were speculating madly about what the impact of AI is going to be on jobs, on services, on education. This is a tsunami heading in our direction. It will completely disrupt many of our social systems, how we learn, what we think about. And if you doubt it, just think of how the internet and digital technologies in the past 10 or 15 years have already changed things. Now, if you were to go back to 1950 and give your grandparents your iPhone, they'd think you were Captain Kirk. And now we take these things so for granted that we complain about the connection speed. So technology is advancing exponentially. And education is part of our response to the challenge that's going to bring. But we're also now the largest generation in human history. We are 7.5 billion people on the planet. And we are draining the Earth's resources, at least the resources required to sustain our way of life. There's a very important analogy, and I want to come back to it just before we're done. It's with agriculture, and that's a big theme of Creative Schools. But a report came out yesterday, which I'm going to tweet about it later on if you're interested in the link. It's the Institute for Biodiversity, which has, it was commenting on the fact that we're now witnessing the fourth extinction of species on the planet, caused by human beings this time. We've lost over half of the world's species in the last couple of generations. Not just animals, but plants. The situation is now we are 7.5 billion people on the Earth, and we have come to depend on about 5 different forms of plant for our survival, 5 main sorts of crop, and 5 animals. I don't mean 5 individual animals, obviously, but types of animal. I mean, the situation's serious. It's not quite that serious yet. So, we inherit an Earth which is richly diverse in every direction. Millions of species of crops and plants and ecosystems. And over the course of the past 300 years, we have ravaged the planet and reduced it to our reliance on a handful of crops and animals. And we've also created conditions where these are not sustainable crops anymore. What the report argues is that it's possible to reverse this situation through the cultivation of diversity and the sustainable cultivation of ecosystems. It is. I'm convinced that's true. And I believe the analogy with the human ecology is exactly the same. We have created education systems during the industrial period which are based on conformity, compliance, and linearity. And human life depends on the exact opposite principles: diversity, creativity, and organic growth. How many of you have got children? I can see you, so if you don't mind raising hands, how many of you have got children? All right. How about 2 children? Or more? Okay. And the rest of you have seen such children, so we can move confidently forward. I'll make you a bet, and I will win this bet. If you've got 2 children or more, I bet you they are completely different from each other, aren't they? You would never confuse them, would you? Like, which one are you? Remind me. And the reason is that human life is predicated, like the rest of the natural world, on diversity of talent, of disposition, of interests, of passions, of outlook, of value. We live in a richly diverse human ecosystem. But our education systems, like our industrial agricultural systems, are monocultural. They're focused on a small swathe of human talent. And the rest of human talent is pathologized as a consequence. So we have children in school who are being falsely diagnosed with learning attention problems, when actually we're giving them an unrelieved diet of tedious test preparation, sitting them down for hours on end, and then blaming them as being some kind of problem. I was in Texas recently, and I'm involved at the moment with a global campaign on the importance of children's play. It's called Dirt is Good. And as part of this is a program funded by Unilever. As part of this, we did a survey of 12,000 families around the world and asked them how much time their children spent outdoors playing. I don't mean at the Little League, with you holding their bag and their jacket shouting at them. I mean, just outside playing, hanging out, making games up. I mean, how much time did you spend doing that when you were children? Probably hours, wasn't it, in a given week? I did. I mean, when I was growing up in England in the 1950s and 1960s, we spent all evening out playing, and all weekend too. We just came home. If there was food, we were like cats. If there was food on the door, we'd come back. And if there wasn't, we'd go and live with a neighbor. It seemed reasonable. Well, nowadays, kids don't play outdoors. It's shocking, but children on average spend less than half an hour a day unsupervised outdoors, sometimes much less than half an hour a day, sometimes no time outdoors, not just in America, but globally. It's worth remembering that the International Convention on the Treatment of Maximum Security Prisoners provides that they get to spend at least 2 hours a day outside, unsupervised. I don't mean roaming the streets free. I mean unsupervised within the boundaries of the prison. But 2 hours a day. Most of our children are spending less time outdoors than high security prisoners. And it's because of the cultural conditions that we've generated for them. So I was in Texas recently, and I was watching a news report, which I found both encouraging and staggering. At school in Texas, and I'll try and find the link and post it too, has apparently had this miraculous insight that if you allow elementary school, if you allow your children outdoors to play during the day, if you have recess 3 times a day for 20 minutes each time, children come back in refreshed, energized, and ready to learn. So, we've rediscovered childhood now. If children go outside and play, they like it, and they're able to concentrate more when they come back in. It's a staggering breakthrough in Texas. We should move there. What I mean is, if you create a system which is inimical to human flourishing, and people don't flourish in it, look at the system. Don't look at the kids and think it's their fault. And please don't get a prescription pad out and pathologize them. Let them get up and run around and do something. Let them be children. So what I'm arguing for is that we need to create conditions in our schools which are congenial with human growth. Here's the thing. Children love to learn. They don't all like being educated, and quite a lot of them have a big problem with school. And this is the irony, because they love to learn. I've just written a book. I'm going to stop doing this, by the way, so you can all relax. But I have just written another book, which is coming out in March for parents. It's called You, Your Child and School. And one of the points I just wanted to make in it is that children are voraciously curious. From the moment they're born, they are voraciously curious and highly competent and expert learners. Think what they do in the first 18 months. In the first 18 months, they learn to speak. For example, not only that, they learn all kinds of things, but among them, along the way, they learn to speak. That's a remarkable achievement if you think of it. And the interesting thing is, if you're a parent, you know this, you didn't teach them how to do it. And you didn't teach them because you couldn't. And you couldn't because you don't know how you do it either. And even if you did, it's far too complicated. You don't sit your child down, do you, at the age of 18 months and say, look, we need to talk. Or more specifically, you do. And this is how this is going to work. Now, you probably noticed your father and I have been making all these noises for the past 18 months. Well, I know it all seems a bit incomprehensible, but some of these are the names of things. We call them nouns, and there'll be 5,000 of them for you to pick up shortly. There are other noises we make which aren't the names of things. They're names of things we do with things, and we call them verbs. There'll be another 5,000 of those, by the way, to get your head around. And if you modulate the tone of your voice, you can indicate whether you have done something or whether you're about to do something. And don't worry about the subjunctive. Nobody really gets that. What I mean is, you don't do that. You don't teach children by direct instruction some of the most important things that they learn. Learning is natural. It's a process of acquiring skills and understanding. Education is a more organized approach to learning, where we plan it more deliberately and we try to make it more systematic. A school, properly conceived, is a learning community. That's all it is. It's a community of learners, people who come together to learn with and from each other. What's happened in the past 200 years is we've come to think of schools in particular ways, as particular sorts of places. And they don't have to be that way at all. We think of schools as places where we divide children into age groups. We don't have to do that. There's no educational reason for doing it. It's an efficiency reason. Outside of school, we don't put all the 8-year-olds in a single compound and keep the 5-year-olds in some separate part of the building. We just do it in school. And it creates problems for learners. We don't divide the world into separate subjects outside school. We do it in school. We don't test people every few months outside of school. We just do it in school. So what I'm saying is the conventions of school, including the hierarchy of disciplines, begin in themselves to create problems which you then try to solve by doubling down on the system. And, I feel that's the inherent problem. Clearly, the system is creating the problems that we're complaining about. I remember talking to a group of school board members recently, and they said, how do we solve these problems of disaffection, of disengagement, of underachievement, of children being turned off learning, and of high dropout rates? How do we solve these problems? And I'm not being facetious when I say, well, stop causing them. That would help. If your shoe hurts, don't polish it. Take it off and try something else. So there are many different ways of doing school. And we've tried the system for a long time. There are many different ways of assessing kids. In America, I say we because I live here, we've spent billions of dollars since No Child Left Behind became law on testing, and it's been a spectacular failure in terms of raising standards, certainly in terms of mediating non-graduation rates, absolutely in terms of improving engagement, curiosity, and enthusiasm for learning. It's been a catastrophe. And yet we keep doing it. And it's a kind of insanity, I think. And therefore, since education is so important, since we send our children to school during the most formative periods of their lives, since it's the foundation of their lives later on, since it's the way that we liberate and cultivate their talents, it's too important to carry on in old habits that manifestly haven't succeeded. So that's why I argue for the need to transform education. And the good news is people want to, parents want it, we all want it, people who work in education want it. So the challenge now, I think, is as large as it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when school systems were first invented. We have to reinvent them. So what's all this got to do with the arts? It's got everything to do with them, as I see it. Not the arts on their own, but the arts in concert with a broader conception of the way schools work. My premise is this, that your children, like you, like me, live in two worlds which are separate but intimately connected. And education has to engage both of them. There's a world which exists whether or not you exist. I mean, you personally, it's true of your children. There's a world that exists whether or not you're in it. It's the world that was here before you got here. It's the world that will be here when you've gone. It's the world of history, of events, of circumstances, of material objects, of other people, other things. The world that you were born into. That world was here before you were, and it exists whether or not you exist. And part of the role of education is to help our children, like it was for us, to understand that world. What is this place we've come to? How does it work? What are its traditions? What are the laws that govern the natural world? What are the achievements of those around us? How do we relate to the rest of the ecosystems that we're part of? Education has to engage children with the world around them and deepen their knowledge and understanding and their ability to navigate within it. But there's another world that exists only because you exist. It's the world that came into being when you did. It's the world of your private consciousness, the world of your inner being, the world of your own private thoughts and feelings, the world that is you, the world that came into being when you did, and that exists only because you exist, and the world that will end when you end. And that's the world through which you experience the world around you, and we need to understand the depth of that world too. And my belief has long been that human resources are like the world's natural resources. They're very diverse. We have all kinds of talents that we don't even know about. They are often hidden. We have to dig for them and find them, and they don't show themselves necessarily or naturally. And thirdly, when we find them, we have to cultivate them and know what to do with them. We have to refine them and practice them. We have lots of capacities, but relatively few abilities. Abilities are what capacities become when we practice them. So education has to address both of these worlds, and the reason so many children are disaffected from school or just go along with it or don't feel very engaged by it is because it doesn't speak to their inner world. We address the outer world in a particular kind of a way through academic programs of various sorts. Well, as I see it, education has four big purposes, and the arts are central to all four of them. In no particular order, one of the purposes of education is economic. The reason that you in New Jersey invest so much in education, like every other school authority and district does, and every government does, state or federal, is because you expect there to be an economic payoff. That's to say, you expect that by educating children, they'll be fit for purpose when they come out, they'll be able to find work, become economically productive, and hopefully economically independent. That there's been, from the beginning, an implicit contract between the education system and the economy, that one will meet the needs of the other somehow. Well, that was true for a long time. It's worth remembering that even a generation ago, almost half the workforce in America was engaged in manufacturing in various capacities or related to it. It's not now. And it's not because we don't do manufacturing as well, it's because we do it better than before. Manufacturing is still a big piece of the American economy, but it's now much more automated. There are fewer jobs, but just as much significance in the output. Well, that's going to change even more. At the moment, well, for the past little while, we've been saying kids need to go into service jobs. But AI may decimate those. So it's irresponsible for us to think about an education system in economic terms without thinking realistically about what kinds of economies, what kinds of jobs what kinds of skills and aptitudes we expect our children to have when they leave school. And it is true that the old academic system is largely educating for an economy that's fast disappearing. One of the great ironies for me is that the testing culture has led to a preoccupation with academic work. And the result of that has been to severely lower the status of vocational programs in schools. So children are leaving schools often with no opportunity to pursue vocational work. Or if they do, it's seen somehow as second rate to go into college to get a degree. I think that's a terrible way to conceive of education, that very many people just want to go into the world of work, and we need to rethink how schools do that. So what have the arts got to do in that? They have a number of things to do with it. One is that there are many opportunities for direct employment in arts and arts-related occupations. The so-called creative industries, the arts and cultural sectors, are major elements of our cities, our communities, and our national economies. They intersect at every point, and not just in the most obvious ways. Even in manufacturing and engineering, aesthetics, design, a sense of aesthetic sensibility and form are fundamental to the success of most of our products. The arts indirectly and directly teach all kinds of things which are relevant to economic success. But there's a second agenda for education, which is cultural. We don't live alone, we live in a world of other people. And knowing how people behave, how they feel, how to express our feelings towards them, how to learn about the history and values and systems of belief in our different cultures, this great rich tapestry of human achievement, is often best done through engagement with the music, art, theatre, dance, through which our cultural values and practices are expressed and made manifest. Human culture is a vast, miraculous treasure trove of feeling, sensibility, experience, and achievement. And part of the role of education is to engage our children in that huge, massive resource, not just in our own cultures, but more generally. There's a social agenda for education. We need our children to be able to connect with our public life, our public institutions, and with the way our communities work. For a long time, I think we've taught our children in groups, but not as groups. And learning is a social process. It's why we learn to speak, or how we learn to speak. We learn it from other people. It's how we learn our values. It's how we learn how to be together and live together. Schools should be social places. And the arts are among the ways in which children are properly socialized. Theatre. I worked in drama in education for quite a long time. Drama is a social practice. It's a social art form. It's the way we get to understand how people's values work, why they behave as they do, how they behave as they do. And it's a deeply important part of how kids learn to be in the world around them. It's true of dance too, by the way. And the fourth agenda, I'm just skimming over all of these for convenience, obviously, but the fourth is personal. Education, in the end, is a personal process. We're dealing with human beings. It's wonderful that we have so much data at our disposal now through the work of Bob and Quadrant and the Arts Education Partnership. Data is important. It's important for diagnostic purposes, but in itself, it doesn't hold the solutions. It doesn't tell us what to do. It gives us a very good picture of what the situation is and where the needs are. And I feel we need more of it, of the right sort. I had a medical last week, a couple of weeks ago, excuse me, as you can tell, and it's just my annual assessment, and I had all kinds of tests, and I'm very pleased to have had them. But being told what my blood count is, what my cholesterol count is, what my heart rate is, and what my liver's up to, it is only part of the story. What I then need is an expert doctor to interpret that, and then we need to agree on some kind of protocol to do something about it. And I think that's where we are just with this now. We have some fantastic, important data which has helped us diagnose the situation for the arts in the school system. The question is, what do we do about it now? Where do we go from here? Well, where I think we need to go with it is to recognize that the arts in all their forms, we're talking about a multifarious collection of human practices and achievements in music and theatre and dance and literature, the verbal arts, and in other cultures, arts practices which don't have those names at all, but which help to define and shape people's experience of the world within them and the world around them. This is a massive resource to education, and they also speak to some of the most fundamental impulses in human life. There isn't a culture anywhere that doesn't manifest itself in its various arts practices. The arts were not invented by the New Jersey Arts Education Partnership. They were out there to begin with. And the challenge we have is to reconfigure their proper place in education, not as a separate bit of the curriculum, but as an integral part of it. I ran a commission a few years ago, well, quite a few years ago now in the UK, on creative education. And we had on the commission artists, scientists, business leaders, technologists, educators. And what was so interesting to me was that we had all the same concerns in common. The problem we had was to understand the different languages we were speaking to get to them. One of the people we had on the group was a man who called Harry Kroto, who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. I think you should know this. I hang out with such people. This was a man who is obviously very good at chemistry. I mean, I'm obviously minimizing to some degree his achievements, but to get the Nobel Prize, you've got to be pretty good at chemistry. I wasn't especially. And he's a wonderful, creative, deeply intuitive man with a deep grasp of his field. One of the other people we had on the group, where we had, apart from, we had several scientists, and we also had two comedians on the group. One of them was a fantastic guy called Lenny Henry, who you may not know here, but a wonderfully gifted guy. He's like a British Chris Rock. I suppose that's the best way to put it. If you can imagine, like a polite Chris Rock. That'd probably get you. So, but Lenny Henry left school at the age of 15 with no qualifications. And I asked him to be on this commission, which was looking at the creative character of education. And he said, who else is on the group? And I went round and I told him, and I said, and by the way, there's this guy called Sir Harry Kroto, Professor Sir Harry Kroto. He said, who's he? I said, he won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. He said, I can't be on the group with him. I said, why? He said, he must have a brain like a planet. You know, he'll make me feel ridiculous every time I speak. I said, I think it'll be all right, because I had dinner the night before with Harry Kroto. And he was really concerned to be on this group because he said, creativity is the heart of science. It's the heart of mathematics. It's the heart of technology, which it is. And there are so many concepts and practices in the arts which are also valid and appropriate in the sciences, and vice versa. We make far too much of these distinctions. They are very similar in their central practices. But he said, so who else is on the group? So I told him, and I said, oh, and Lenny Henry is on the group. He said, the comedian. I said, yes. He said, I can't be on that group. I said, why? He said, he's got a mind like a razor blade. He'll cut me to pieces. Well, of course, they met, and a full-blown bromance broke out within minutes. They were hanging out, it led to all kinds of personal catastrophes. No, not really, but they really connected. So here was a group of very, very specialists, and as soon as we sat down to make common cause, we could see the science and the arts and the sciences, and how all of these things interact in this closely woven fabric of human culture, achievement, and learning. So I think we have a dual agenda here. One is, collectively, all of us have to think bravely and adventurously about the sorts of schools we need now to do justice to our children's talents, to the great diversity of their capacities, but which also engage them properly in the world around them and prepare them in the right way to be productive members of that world around them. And many of the inherent assumptions and practices in our current systems, because we've become so used to them, are simply not fit for purpose now. None of this can happen overnight, but it can happen over time if we set our course properly and understand the process of change in the right way. It's a double agenda. It's to look at an education system which speaks to the nature of our children, and which then also looks at the world and how they can connect into it. The last thing I want to say, because I know I'm out of time, just the last thing is this. I mentioned this report on biodiversity. It's a really important analogy. The natural world thrives on diversity and on dynamic relationships between the different elements of our ecosystems. Not one thing or the other. The problem is that we've lost sight of that in the way we run how we engage with the natural world. The Industrial Revolution was the crucible for our education systems, for mass systems of education. I think the real analogy between the way our systems have evolved is not industrial manufacturing, it's industrial agriculture. Industrial agriculture began pretty much in the 18th century, and it revolutionized farming practices. it was made possible by three innovations. It was made possible by mechanization, which made it possible to cultivate vast tracts of land in a fraction of the time and with a fraction of the effort. And that led to huge monocultural plantations, potatoes as far as you could see, corn as far as you could see. And prior to that, it really was less practical to think in those ways. The second innovation was chemical fertilizers, which made things grow much more quickly than they would naturally. And that spoke to something very important, because the industrial economy was focused on output and yield, and these created much higher yields. But the problem was that these monocultural crops, which were being falsely fed, were also losing much of their natural protectiveness, which led to the production of chemical pesticides. The result of all of that has been massive yields, but we've destroyed topsoils, we've polluted waterways, and these systems, as we know now, are not sustainable. And they're not sustainable because they run against the grain of natural systems. We've done, I think, the same thing with education. We've become focused on output and yield, on graduation rates, retention rates, positions in international league tables, and we've created conditions in schools which are not conducive to natural learning. We sit people down for hours on end. We deprive them of physical exercise. We separate disciplines. We separate age groups. We put people apart and test them individually. What organic agriculture realizes is that our farming practices have to be sustainable and natural. There's just one key difference I want to end on here, which is that sustainable farmers these days, coming from lots of different directions, and there is a revolution happening in farming, realize that the way you have sustainable, healthy ecosystems is not by focusing on the plant or the animal, but you focus in the case of plants, not on the plant, but on the soil. If you get the soil right, plants will be fine. They will thrive. And they will thrive long-term because the soil on which they depend will be healthy, vital, and renewable. And you do that through having natural process of cross-fertilization, mixed crops, rotational systems like we had before industrialization, and natural process of composting. If you do all of that, you bring back topsoils, you refresh the landscape, you revive ecosystems, and all the things that depend upon them by focusing on the soil. And I think we should do the same thing in education. That what we've lost sight of in our desperate drive for higher test results and output and yield is the vitality of the culture of learning. Great schools have always known that. They need to have a mixed economy. Great science, yes. Great technology, absolutely. Great mathematics, yes. But great music and great art and great literature, great humanities programs, performances, festivals, people being engaged so their talents can be fulfilled in all the different ways they might take them, but which together create a rich ecosystem of learning where children want to be and where they benefit from taking part. And if we get the culture of learning right, then all the results we're so concerned about will take care of themselves. And that's, I think, the great historic challenge we face now. Not to reinstate the arts at the margins of education, but to see them as one of the nutrients in a vibrant culture of learning in all of our schools.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Ken Robinson. Come on, you can do more.
Thank you very much.
And before we say goodbye, I just, there's one thing that Ken hit on over and over that I think is really the core of our work. He talked about creating conditions. We often talk in terms of our job with Arts Ed New Jersey through the partnership is to create the right kind of conditions in our schools so arts learning can take place. I mean, that is our job. The other thing is the census data, the data that we've put out is very important from the standpoint that we have documented what is happening, but it does not create the solutions to how we address it. And that's the work of this body. It's the work that we will take on not only the remainder of this afternoon, but the work we will do moving forward beyond the work today. So, I just wanted to say again, Sir Ken, thank you for taking the time out of your very busy travel schedule to be with us, to share your words of wisdom, to inspire us to continue with our work moving forward. And we wish you continued success, and my love to Lady Terry when you see her back home. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And thank all of you for all you're doing. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, wave goodbye. There we go. And we're out. So a couple of things that we want to do. We have another hour session for you to go back to your breakout groups to start working on some ideas, priorities, and solutions. I do not want you to feel pressure like you've got to figure it all out in the next hour. You're going to solve the arts education issues for our state in the next hour, right? That's not going to happen. We recognize it, but what we want to do is we want to see you continue the conversation, and then what we plan on doing is convening follow-up conference calls with the groups so they can continue the work forward. So it doesn't stop here, but we will continue the work group activities once we move forward from this summit so that we can really lay out an action plan to help move us forward.